It's nice to see you here, and thank you for coming. My name is Nina Danino, and I'm one part of the curating Colab for this series, which is Religion and Art, and it's been going since 2000. And this is the latest iteration of it, which is the Colab version of it, of which this is session 3. So this initiative has been funded by Chase, and I always, at the beginning of each session, thank Chase, and also our partner, which is Essex University, the LIFS department, which is Literature, Film and Theatre, and particularly our co-partner there, who is Professor Jeffrey Geiger. And also Arts Chaplaincy Project, which is Mark, and he might say something about that, and Reverend Jenny Adams of Holy Trinity Church for hosting and allowing us to be here. So really, without further ado, I think that is all I want to say before handing over to Mark for a brief word, and then handing over to Teresa Calonje, who is going to lead this panel. And a very warm welcome to you, and I hope you will enjoy this session.
Hi, yes, so I'm just to say hello to you also. Welcome, my name's Mark Dean. I coordinate Arts Chaplaincy Projects. You're very welcome here. Just a little bit of housekeeping. If you need the loo, it's just through there. You can see the doors there on the right. If you keep going straight through, keep going through the sort of little nursery school, you'll find it. And then just remember how to come back, and that'll be fine. The session is timed until 4. I don't know whether we necessarily use the whole time, but it's available. But there's at 4, then Imperial College Choir are coming in to set up for an evensong tonight at 5:30, which you'd be very welcome if you're still around to come along to. It's a wonderful choir. There's some original music recently composed, and so you'd be very welcome. That's at 5:30, but we will need to pack up at 4 to do a bit of a quick turnaround, just to give you a heads up. Please do enjoy the afternoon, and look forward to hearing from you all later on. And just to hand over to Teresa now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark and Nina, and for this Religion and Art initiative. And thank you for organizing these Colab events, so we have a chance to come together and work collaboratively and think together. Thank you, Rob, for the technical bits. And thank you, Louise and Elena, for coming and accepting my invitation. I think the way that I see the event happening is I'll start by introducing the 2 guest speakers. Then I will do a presentation and myself and raise some questions. And then we'll hear from Nina about the film, and we'll show an extract of her film, Now I'm Yours, from 1992. And then we'll hear from Louise and then Elena, and then we will open to questions after that. So thank you, Louise, for coming. Louise is Professor of Church History at the PTHU in the Netherlands and a non-stipendiary lecturer in theology at St. John's College, Oxford. She has published widely on the Middle English mystics and mysticism more generally, including on the relationship between mysticism and the arts. Her short documentary film, Complete Surrender, came out in 2022 and followed artists engaging with the work of Adevich and Marguerite Porete, and won a number of awards. She's also founder and co-convener of the Mystical Theology Network. Thank you, Elena, for coming. Elena is a Canadian artist based in London whose practice spans painting, sculpture, and installation. At its center are meticulous rendered apocalyptic oil paintings executed with 3-haired brushes on either a miniature or monumental scale. She's a graduate of Centre St. Martin's of Goldsmith and the University of Cambridge, where she studied philosophical theology. Elena explores the ontology of artistic making. She's currently artist in residence at the St. Bartholomew the Great, where she is showing a co-curated exhibition with James Freeman called Slipping the Veil, and I hope you'll be talking about that. So without further ado, I thought I would explain how I got to this point in my research, in which two apparently distant worlds, that are that of the spiritual and the world of performance art, came into dialogue. I was brought up in a practicing Catholic family. My mother's room is still today stacked up from top to bottom with religious and mystical books. I was named after Teresa of Avila and Thérèse de Lisieux, Teresa of Avila being the Carmelite 16th century nun, and Teresa of Lisieux, another Carmelite 19th century nun. My first and probably my only one-to-one experience, quality time with my mother until today was when she took me to see Alain Cavalier's Thérèse, the experimental film Thérèse. I was only 6 at the time. My relationship with both Teresa and Thérèse have since evolved as they've accompanied me all my life. Now, later on, I pursued my studies in art, and early I specialized in dance, contemporary dance and performance art, much to my mother's amazement. It would have been easier for her had I gone into studying medieval icons, but I was fascinated and still am fascinated with the question of the body, incarnation and being, living, loving, and art making in and through the body. During my PhD in the art department at Goldsmith, I focused on the commercialization of the event of performance. And as I was writing my third and final chapter, so by the end, near to the end of my thesis, when I was working on the work of Brazilian artist Luisa Nobrega, I randomly came across a book in a bookshop in Paris by Simone Weil. It was A Waiting for God. Simone Weil was a French classicist, philosopher, activist who died in 1943, considered by some as being a Gnostic and by others to be a Christian mystic. Now, Weil, I became obsessed with Weil, and suddenly I realized, without it quite being my intention, that she took over much of the third chapter of my thesis. And I put her in dialogue with the artist Luisa Nobrega and myself. So we came into there was a sort of dialogue between the three of us doing that in that third chapter. I found myself trying to make sense of both of their early disappearances. One transitioned and left Luisa behind, and the other, Simone Weil, died too early from self-starvation or cardiac arrest. Doctors couldn't quite make up their mind. Both wanted to undo the self, to self-withdraw. Both very stubborn, wanted to make space for something else. Luisa's durational performances involved a single gesture that she would stretch in time, usually until exhaustion. One involved her lying on a scaffolding 5 meters above the ground, with her head hanging on the edge of a plank for over 30 hours. A metaphor of an ego's decapitation, the decapitation of the phallic sovereign subject, perhaps. In another action, she buried and immobilized her right hand and sat still at a desk for over 30 hours without apparently eating or drinking anything during that time, without performing any action. During another of her actions that lasted 3 days, she performed blindfolded, another mutilation of her senses. Now, how could those actions of undoing the self and unperforming relate to my reading of Simone Weil? Could Weil's writing from the 1930s and 40s help shed some light on what Nobrega was doing in 2010? Father, in the name of Christ, grant me this, that I may be unable to will any bodily movement like a total paralytic, that I may be incapable of receiving any sensation like someone who is completely blind, deaf, and deprived of all senses, that I may be unable to make the slightest connection between two thoughts, even the simplest. These words, this prayer, is from Weil, not from Nobrega. But wasn't Nobrega performing just that? Weil continues her prayer to the Father, saying, "May my faculties of hearing, sight, taste, smell, and touch, register the perfectly accurate impress of thy creation. May this mind in fullest lucidity connect all ideas in perfect conformity with thy truth. In other words, for Veil, it was herself that she wished would be suppressed. But she did not want to stop there. That was not the aim. The aim was to remove the first person of the subject, the I, only to make space for God, thy, so thy could dwell in her and be all in her and in creation. All this Veil wrote in her notebooks and personal letters. They were not edited, nor meant for publication. Her writings then have been published, though, after her death, and some only recently. And there's been a recent interest in her concept, particularly in her concept of decreation, which I find quite useful to understand the work of Nobrega. Simone Veil's mentions decreation actually only very few times in her writing, but it was very much a mode of living for her. She took the notion of decreation from various sources, all outside philosophy and Western metaphysics. She found in the Kabbalistic tradition, the Tzimtzum, a term used to explain God's contraction in creation. God created by contracting his infinite divinity to allow a finite space to appear, an empty space to permit human existence. Veil was also influenced by the Greek concept of kenosis, taken on in early Christianity by Paul in his letters, as he writes about Christ's incarnation and death on the cross, both being acts of divine withdrawal to open to or take on humanity. Veil might have also been influenced by some of her readings of mystics. She was reading, we know, a 13th century Marguerite Porete and John of the Cross's writing, The Dark Night of the Soul. Veil's concept of decreation, though, is ethical and political as much as it is spiritual. It is a radical move out of the way and a voluntarily existential transgression of the subject. It was very much part of her other-centered mode of thinking and being, awaiting for Christ, the infinite and the absolute other. For her to remain with an empty stomach, to be speechless without words that fill the mouth, were physical, visible ways to remain in that waiting. Now, as I continued my research, I came across other contemporary thinkers that all of them who had a strong influence in performance theory, and realized that they were also turning and being influenced by Christian mysticism. The poet Anne Carson published Decreation in 2006, for instance, is a collection of poems and essays which included pieces on Marguerite Porete and Simone Veil, alongside some of her reflections on Sappho, the Greek poet. Julia Kristeva published her long research on our beloved Teresa of Avila in 2008, fascinated by the religious woman taken over by the sexual experience of union, who thinks and loves in and through her body, who longs for and desires union. It's not an isolated being, but a being in relation, who is, thinks, and loves in surrendering herself to the loved absolute other. Fred Moten is another example I wanted to point. In his essay, Blackness and Nothingness, in 2013, developed his concept of black mysticism of the flesh. Moten makes recourse to theological imagination and the mystical impulse as a fugitive escape from the confines of Western philosophy in order to rethink embodiment in another way, in a yearning to escape the brutal physicality and violence of ontology's objectification of being. These are the theoretical encounters. However, many artists have turned to Christian mysticism, and I would like to mention in particular those colleagues from Goldsmiths who are working on this dialogue. Kate Pickering, in particular, Kate Pickering and her reading and rewriting of Julian of Norwich and her interest in the mystic voice. Sophie Slade Johnson and her interest in Gnosticism, in the sacred and the profane, and her approach to the cloud of unknowing through the sight of the marsh. And Catherine Ludwig's approach to Catherine of Siena and her relation to the wounds and the stigmata, signifiers of the mystical closeness with God. All these encounters have led us to today and the purpose of this conversation, which I hope is only the beginning of more. I hope we can continue to bring these two worlds into new perspective and together, innocently and with care. The world of Christian mysticism, that is the mysticism of the Word made flesh, and performance art, the art that exists and remains in the body. What is it about Christian mystics that resonates with contemporary art practitioners, and in particular those working in and through the body? What is the Christian approach to loving and thinking in the body that is so attractive to us today? It is not a mode of being that escapes, that keeps adding property and actions to the self, but that lets go, surrenders and withdraws to give space for the other. It is a resistance to individualism and to the subject that recognizes itself in its own thought, or even in its own actions or works, rather than in its relation to the other. So there are 5 key areas and key questions I'd like us to expand on and explore, confront and rethink, which are the question of the body, of language, of the experience, and the appropriation of the mystics. Now, rest assured that the aim today is not to answer or cover all of these areas, but maybe I propose these as cracks and maybe bridges, openings to explore further. And please, Elena, Louise, Mark, Nina, any one of you, make sure you correct me when I confuse things even further. So, number 1 is the question of the body. I'm afraid that I can approach the medieval understanding of the mystic body easier through what it is not. It was not the Roman corpus, Latin for body, already by law available as a thing, distinguished and captured within the confines of the skin. The corpus can be calculated, objectified, is susceptible to analysis, and hence already available as property. Neither was it a Gnostic body considered as the rest of the created world as fundamentally and irredeemably evil. Neither is it a Protestant body which prioritizes the life of the mind. The difference between the Protestant and the Catholic body might find its paradigm in the theological differences in the approach to the Eucharist. Protestants generally view the bread and wine in communion as symbolic representations of Christ's body and blood, while Catholics believe in transubstantiation, a literal transformation of the substance of the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. Body and blood are not only a memory of, which remains at the intellectual level, but our divine presence. Now, I'm not saying that the mystic experience is transubstantiation. That will probably get me into trouble. But what I do want to point out is that for the mystic, similarly to what happens in the Eucharist, the physicality of the body has the capacity to absorb the divine and become a place of sacramental encounter. Neither was the mystic body a Cartesian body, which viewed mind and body as distinct substances, which led to the distinction between the thinking subject and the body of thought. Mind and body, after Descartes, as Weil wrote, became strangers from one another. The mystical body might be closer to what the Germans call der Lieb, meaning the living body, a word that Martin Heidegger used in order to avoid the other German word for body, that is the Körper, derives from the Latin corpus. Lieb is soft and emerging in relation. It's neither a thing, nor is it corporeal. It is open, permeable, maternal, and wounded. In The Interior Castle, Teresa Calonje uses the water as a metaphor to speak about the union of all her being, including her body, to God. In the 7th mansion, in the 7th and last mansion, Teresa compares her mystical unions with the rain falling from the sky into the river. You can no longer tell the water that falls from the sky from the water of the river. God and her entire self can no longer tell each other apart from each other. How can today's understanding of the body relate to this mystical body? How does this body relate to the body of performance, a body produced and producing, a performative body, always in need of the gaze of an audience, a body that becomes aesthetic? Now my second point is on language. The mystic experience is as the feminine jouissance for the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, a fundamentally incommunicable, inarticulate experience. But then most of these mystics were asked, often by their spiritual directors, sometimes by the Inquisition, to write, to translate their raptures into language, to exteriorize what had been an intimate interior erotic movement of the soul. Teresa of Avila, as all women in her time, was never taught Latin, which was reserved for the men and the sacred. But Teresa, such as Julian of Norwich or Catherine of Siena or the Cloud author, wrote in their vernacular language and in Teresa's mother tongue, which was Spanish. She often dictated. Vernacular is associated with orality, organic transformation, a language intrinsically grammarless, incarnate and effective. The mystics might have escaped grammar, but they remained in the word. They remained within the constraints of the flesh and of language, but they did so differently. They did not get caught in the gibberish, the uncontrollable, inarticulate cry without end. Rather, they used poetry, symbolism, and metaphor to describe their love. Often, even deprived of any sort of books, they were inspired by the liturgical readings they heard during the offices, communal prayers, and Mass, but also in their day-to-day, inspired by nature, what happened in the kitchen, kneading their own bodies, the wounded and sick bodies they served. How can this search for another language, another mode of communication speak to us? And what about the unending debates and performance theory around the documentation and the mistranslations of the event of performance into other technological supports? Number 3, I'm nearly there. What is the mystical experience we're talking about? How can we possibly relate the intimate, personal experience of the mystics, not even desired nor fabricated, but given, to the lived experience produced and offered in our contemporary experience economy? Experience economy being a concept that was popularized by business consultants Pine and Gilmer in their book from 1999. So in order to distinguish what experience we might be talking about, we can turn again to the two German words for the experience, one being Erfahrung and the other Erlebnis. Erfahrung is related to wisdom, to sacrifice and risk, whereas Erlebnis is mainly sensorial and is understood as something one can have that leaves an inner immediate impression and builds subjectivity. The mystic's experience might be closer to Erfahrung, which, according to Walter Benjamin, is an experience that must be plunged into darkness. We must allow it to sink into the bottom of the ocean, only to emerge, maybe or maybe never, or maybe not, like a pearl. I would suspect the mystic experience is not Erlebnis. It is not a romantic, intense experience that builds the mystic's ego into a hyper-subject. Erlebnis today is found as fetishized, always accessible, intense, and personal experiences to be had, to be consumed, and which feed into a contemporary desire for intense life. And I'm thinking of some immersive theatre, or even the experience of audiences when they go into to a museum to see Tino Segal performance and loop, or even Marina Abramovich's quasi-religious durational performance, The Artist is Present, from 2012. So, 4, appropriating the mystics. What remains today from the mystics are letters, written accounts of love affairs between them and God. Teresa wrote the majority of her work in obedience to her superiors. These accounts were not to be studied as literary works from an aesthetic point of view, or treated as artistic artifacts. The Cloud of Unknowing, John of the Cross, Teresa were written to help others in their spiritual journeys. They were guides and instructions to be used for spiritual transformation. Teresa wrote as a spiritual mother, La Madre, to her nuns, and her writing is still read today in spiritual teaching. However, once these experiences are written down, recorded, and translated into an object of thought, they run the risk of also becoming appropriable, ready at hand, movable, decontextualized, and might be today also at risk of historical presentism. Teresa was soon captured by authors and artists after her death. We will see in a moment in Nina's film how Lorenzo Bernini entombed her in the marble of his sculpture, The Exorcist from 1652. And then both Teresa and Bernini are captured again by Nina in her film from 1992, and then by us here today. What happens when the intimate private relation of the mystic moves from the hidden space into the public space? In The Human Condition, Hannah Arendt writes, there are very relevant matters which can survive only in the realm of the private. For instance, love, in distinction from friendship, is killed, or rather extinguished, the moment it is displayed in public. Because of its inherent worldlessness, love can only become false and perverted when it is used for political purposes. So how then to handle with care, how to be attentive and caring as one approaches the mystics and the mystical encounter, as our ego becomes a third person in the room, an intruder in between the bride and the groom? With these questions in mind, I would like to move on to Nina, and who will introduce an extract of Now I'm Yours from 1992. Nina is an artist, filmmaker, and reader in fine art at Goldsmiths. She has made experimental narrative films which center on self-inscription, the feminine, and the subjective voice. Her film, Now I'm Yours, follows the writings of Teresa of Avila, and she's also produced other pieces. But only to mention her film installation Communion from 2010 and the multimedia work Sorelle Povere di Santa Chiara from 2015 to 2018. Her films are shown worldwide, including in film festivals, cinemas, and museums. And thank you, Nina, for showing us a little extract here for the first time in this format.
Thank you very much, Teresa. I mean, I just found that introduction so rich and so incredible, touching on so many aspects of things that I was engaging with when I made this film. And you've kind of brought it all back in a way, because this film goes back in time for me, to 1992. So I'm very grateful to Teresa for inviting it here in this context, and also for, in a way, recurating it for this context. Normally this film was made for cinema, which is a 32-minute film, and it was also televised, actually. In a shorter form, because they didn't want it so long. They wanted, so I shortened it for them. But this is the first time it's being curated in this space as an extract. And I'm just talking about the curation now, and that's okay. But also the sound will be on the speakers of the church, which is wonderful. I think you might get the articulacy of it, you might not. It kind of doesn't matter. I like the sound of it in the church. And this film also, in working at the intersection of art, the art world, and the film world, which I do, I'm kind of positioned a little bit more towards film, but this film had very unhappy kind of expositions in galleries, at the time of the 90s, when the YBAs were very strong and all that. And I never showed it again in a gallery. It was just wrong. It's always for cinema. So this is the first time it's been curated for this space, and I really, really like it. And it's also only an extract, but it's fine, you don't have to see the whole film. So I suppose just to maybe pick up on a few things that Teresa was sort of saying, one of the things was that the film is about the impossibility of representation, I suppose. Coming from experimental film, the issue of representation and how to resist representation in a way, which is another form of resistance, was really important, and how to bypass to different languages of representation in order to be able to get to, in this instance, the language of the language that was not really possible, in the sense of that I'm talking about Teresa, and she is talking about what is impossible to put into language. So it was that relationship between the image and the sound. And for me at that point, I came to this film really, of course I knew Teresa from my own background, But I came to it again through Lacan, Lacan's seminar 20, which is encore on the jouissance of woman. And in that seminar, he exhorts the reader to go and look at the statue in Rome, to go and look at the Bernini statue in Rome. And because there he thought he saw jouissance being displayed. I think that's what he meant, I'm not sure. But and so he says, go and look at the statue in Rome. And when I got the Experimenter Award for this film from Channel 4, I was able to do that. I was able to travel to Rome and look at the statue and film the statue. But what I saw there was really interesting, because what I saw was like a funerary statue. It was a locked kind of space. It was of course, wonderful. It was amazing, but it was also quite locked. And so what I thought I felt like I needed to do was release the voice of the literary writer, Teresa as a writer, as a woman writing, speaking through the voice, and kind of unlock her through the fixed stone, which I felt at the time was oppressive. Or trapped in the stone. So the sound and the voice were really important in this film. And I will tell you a little bit more about it if you're interested later. But it was a new thing, first of all, to invite a saint like Teresa into experimental film. And this film was shown at the Co-op in the context of the Co-op, London Filmmakers Co-op. And that was really, really difficult, actually, to do that in some ways. But it was also fantastic to be able to find the way to release the voice through out of the stone. And in that I worked with a singer called Shelley Hirsch, and I did the recitals and she did the vocals. And so we kind of put it together live in the main. And so it's a voice. It's a film about soundtrack and about the impossibility of representation, and about jouissance and the impossibility of the presentation of jouissance, going back to Lacan and undoing the self. Just to finally say, it's not a hagiographical Teresa. It's not about me personally. It's a kind of undoing a plurality of the self, of the different subjective selves that emanate from this territory that is created as a kind of network of materials and images and sound and narrations, and Teresa's own text, of course, as well. She spoke so freely about this and of other things that on the next morning she remarked to me, "How I forgot myself last night. These desires and this love of mine made me lose all sense of proportion." I found myself dying of this desire, this love. It came to me in mighty impulses. Nothing gave me satisfaction, and I could not contain myself. When these impulses come on me, I exert all my strength to resist, because I am afraid of delusions. This desire grows so intense that its extreme distress robs the soul of all consciousness. It seems to be on the point of death, fainting almost completely away in a kind of swoon. Her breath and all her bodily powers progressively fail. Her eyes close involuntarily. If you read in this state, you can scarcely make out a single letter. You hear, but only dimly, as if from far away. It is the same with the tongue. You cannot form nor have the strength to pronounce a single word. One can do absolutely nothing, only utter a few slight moans, not aloud, but inwardly, out of pain. It is impossible to describe this wound, this very great but so sweet a pain. It is like being pierced to the depths of the entrails, or sometimes to the heart. It is like a voice crying out to take breath.
I wish that someone would explain these death-like yearnings, tell me what they mean. Sometimes my pulse ceases to beat at all. All my longing at this time is to die. I forget everything in this longing, this abandonment, this loneliness. That night, I was suddenly seized with a rapture so strong that it almost completely took me out of myself. I sat down, and I remember now that I could neither see the elevation nor hear the Mass. Wandering around this place, I found the stone seat where they sat pictured, a small family, a blind spot. A footnote to this entry says, see Teresa's commentary on the Song of Songs. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your breasts are sweeter than wine. I was thinking just now as I wrote this that a verse which I have already quoted, Telatastico meum, speaks of the heart being enlarged. I do not think that this happiness has its source in the heart at all. It arises in a much more interior part, like something of which the springs are very deep. Then I heard a very soft voice speaking to me in a whisper. All my hair stood on end with terror. He told me not to consider myself forgotten, for he would never abandon me, and that I must do everything in my power to help myself, and other things as well, that there is no need to repeat. I wished to live, and clearly saw that I was not living, but wrestling with the shadow of death. There was no one to give me life. For many years I read a great deal and understood nothing, and for a long while I could never find the words with which to explain, and this caused me no small distress. I felt a fire inside, an agony of soul, an oppression, a suffocation, an affliction so agonizing and accompanied by such hopeless and distressing misery that no words I could find would adequately describe this inward fire and this despair. I could not see my torturer, but I seemed to feel myself burnt and dismembered. It was a pestilential spot, deprived of all hope of comfort. I had been put into what seemed a hole in the wall, and the very walls pressed in on me and completely stifled me. There was no light there, only the deepest darkness. Yet although there was no light, it was possible to see everything that brings pain to the sight. I do not know how this can be. I was very restless and disturbed, and unable to recollect myself. I was fighting and struggling, and I could not contain my thoughts from straying. I was alone, with no company to give me relaxation, but was stunned by all these trials and by fear that the devil might be deceiving me. I was utterly disquieted and did not know what to do. When I was in this state of great exhaustion, these words alone were enough to dispel it and to quieten me completely. Have no fear, daughter. I will not forsake you. Have no fear.
Ardiente. Arena. Aridez. Chillino. Desierto. Silencio.
Okay, so I've got a bit of a cold, so I hope you can hear me. I'll try not to have a coughing fit in the middle of my presentation. So I'm very grateful to Teresa for this invitation to speak today about Christian mysticism. And my understanding is that one of the aims of this session is to further conversation about modern artistic engagement with earlier mystics, many of whom were female. And this is the area of my research from a theological perspective. So in thinking about this afternoon, I was reminded or struck by Cynthia R. Nielsen's claim that the work's truthfulness is experienced in its ability to continue to speak meaningfully and transformatively about the human condition to those who are willing to enter its play. Now, Nielsen is here speaking about Gadamer's approach to art, but I think we might equally apply these words to the texts of female mystics, many of whom invite readers into their performances of union with the divine, and who many modern mystics have viewed as dialogue partners in speaking meaningfully and transformatively about the human condition. A performative engagement with these texts is, from an academic perspective, therefore legitimate. For some of these mystics, and I'll mention 3 mystics, but only talk really about 2 of them. So for some of these early mystics, like the 14th century Marguerite Porete, this performativity works at the level of language. Marguerite confounds the reason of the reader through puns and oxymorons, inviting them into a play of love that Michael Sells calls performative apophasis. That is, a performance that undoes itself. For others, this performance is more physical or imaginative. And it's on these latter modes of performance that I want to concentrate this afternoon, discussing Elizabeth of Spolbeck's 13th century physical performance of the Passion, and Julian of Norwich's 14th century imaginative one, both of which expect a level of participation from the viewer or reader. So turning first of all to Elizabeth of Spolbeck, I want to begin with a story that is told by Philip of Clairvaux, abbot of the Cistercian Abbey of Clairvaux. Between 1266 and 67, he witnessed Elizabeth of Spolbeck giving a rapturous performance of the Passion, something she enacted every day before a live audience. The story perhaps needs a trigger warning. It's worth noting that Philip did not understand Elizabeth's native Dutch and worked through translators recording hers as a mute performance. So it possibly was mute, but she doesn't speak at all. So he records how, at midnight indeed, Elizabeth rises in a wonderful way to acknowledge the beginning of our Lord's Passion. That is to say, how he was taken and drawn hither and thither very cruelly at the hands of men. She, Elizabeth, is in a state of rapture. The performance continues to brutal effect. See how she takes her own clothes before her breasts with her right hand and draws herself to the right with the other. And then on the left side, on the left side, and the other hand she bends herself, and the other times she bends herself forward many times, as if she were drawn with violence, as men do to thieves and murderers, representing our Lord Jesus' words when he said, "You come to take me as a thief with swords and sticks." And then later she stretches out her right arm and makes a fist of her hand and looks sternly and brandishes her fist and makes threatening gestures with her eyes and hands, just as someone would who was enraged. And after this, she hits herself on the cheeks so strongly that the power of her hitting causes her body to bend double against the ground. Then she hits herself on the back of the head and between her shoulders and then on the neck, and she leans forward and twists her body and dashes her head on the floor. And in other moments, she violently takes hold of the short hair on her forehead and hits the ground with her head with an incredible pulling action until her feet remain immobile. Now with the flat of the hand, now with a fist, now with her fingers drawn together, she takes hold of her own cheeks, which previously she had hit many times, as though she would pull out her lower jaw. And she closes her fingers in her palms so that just her thumbs stick out, and with them she sets about her eyes, now one and now another, as though she would dig them out or bore them in. Later in the monastic day, the performance takes on the form even more so of what has been called a macabre dance, with Elizabeth balancing with one foot on top of another, while, I quote, twisting herself around her breast, back and sides, end quote, and moving up and down to the floor without moving her feet. She also bleeds. Philip writes, "We saw blood, not bright red, but as though it was mixed with water, running out of a hole in her tunic on her bosom. And we saw not only the outer clothes that touched the girl's flesh, that is to say her hands, feet and side, sprinkled and dyed with blood, but also her breasts were all drenched with blood running from her eyes, and also at other times blood ran out of the ends of her fingers between the nails and flesh." Philip is convinced that the performance is a genuine revelation, and concludes that it seems that in a new and unheard of manner, she shows her in herself both the person of Christ's suffering and his enemies tormenting him. He concludes that Elizabeth gives everyone the ability to learn from reading a living image of our own salvation and an animate history of redemption, not in the parchment or in the documents, but in the limbs and body of our young girl we recall here. I mean of an unmistakably alive and living Veronica. By calling her a Veronica, Philip refers to a legend that Christ imprinted his image, the image of his face, on Veronica's scarf as he wiped it on the way to Golgotha, leaving behind a physical trace of himself, an idea similar to the Trin Shroud. Sarah Macmillan comments that in so doing, I quote, "Philip is specifically directing his audience to read Elizabeth's body," end quote. She continues, I quote, As the Veronica, Elizabeth is a carbon copy of Christ," end quote. Julian, the other mystic that we will discuss, writes of the Veronica being suspended in Rome such that it shimmers in the light, almost like a kind of transparency through which the viewer gazes. And it seems to me that this is what Elizabeth has become in Philip's account. What I find particularly disturbing about her performance is that Elizabeth seems to vanish. Although we see her all the time in shocking reality, in a spectacle that might otherwise perform domestic abuse, she disappears into Christ in such a way that Philip fails to see her and her suffering anymore. She becomes a kind of empty vessel, her body only good to be a Cistercian competitor for the Franciscans' stigmatized St. Francis, whose body also bore the marks of Christ's wounds. Yet Christian accounts of union with God are not intended to imply obliteration or evacuation. They should rather emphasize relation. As Rob Fasson explains, union was conceived of as an act of divine love, the love of the believer and God coming together in a kind of mysterious harmony. Fasson stresses that if either party is swallowed up by this love, love itself would cease, since love always demands an other. And this brings me to the second mystic, Julian of Norwich. The importance of such an understanding of relationality is clearly indicated in Julian of Norwich's Revelations of Divine Love, which she composed herself in Middle English after receiving a series of visions of the Passion in 1373 at the age of 30. Julian begins by recording a gruesome experience of suffering in which her dying clearly mirrors Christ's own. Both she and those around her thought that she would not survive. In the midst of this, Julian receives 16 visions of the Passion, but they are not what she had earlier prayed for, that is, a kind of witness, to be a kind of witness through imagination of the event, a form of devotion that had become extremely prevalent by the 14th century. Indeed, she wrestles with the relative value of performative imagination. All she can see is Christ, especially his bleeding head, which she sees all the time, no matter what else she sees. When she asks for more light to see the narrative details normally associated with the life of Christ genre, which Elizabeth Dance recounts, she's told that Christ is her illumination and will show her what is necessary. Having miraculously recovered from her illness, she initially records these visions in an extant short text, but after some 20 years of meditation on them, creates a long text that is highly performative, both at the level of language and image. That hers is a relational performativity can be illustrated, I think, if we consider images that Julian adds to the long text. One such image that is not often commented on is found in chapter 17, where Jesus compares Christ on the cross to the laundry being hung up to dry. She writes, "I saw 4 manners of dying. The first was bloodlessness. The second was the pain that follows this. The third was being hung up in the air as men hang out a cloth to dry." As Julian watches Christ's body slowly drying and changing colour in her mind's eye, noting its weight against the nails, she's struck by the words, "I thirst," that Christ says in the Gospel. Her vision is reminiscent of the meditation on the Passion of our Lord at the 9th hour in the Meditations of the Life of Christ, a Franciscan devotional meditation manual, which invites the reader to meditate on his whole life. This particular meditation invites readers to contemplate how the words "I thirst" signify that Christ was, I quote, inwardly drained by loss of blood and was dried out, end quote. As Julian observes what she can see of this scene, which again for her is only Christ, she notices a dry, bitter wind and an intense cold that is the cause of this drying, an idea not mentioned in either the Gospels or the Meditations, in which she associates the crucifixion of Christ with Christ as laundry. It's not clear exactly where this image comes from. Within the roof bosses of Norwich Cathedral, the iconography of the Passion includes a laundress wrestling with a thief who is trying to steal her sheets. There is the possibility then that Julian incorporates a bodily devotional image into her imaginative reflections. Equally, she might just be reflecting on actual laundry. Carol Rawcliffe notes that while it had been thought that laundry was not a medieval priority, think of Game of Thrones, in fact, clean, sweet-smelling sheets were connected with health in the Middle Ages, becoming more so after the outbreak of the plague in 1349, which killed around 2/3 of the English population. This is something that, as a young girl, Julian would have lived through. Some monasteries employed not only laundresses but also male launderers, so as to ensure that only men handled the linen of the altar, such laundry being associated with both purity and, in this case, the Eucharist. It is perhaps unsurprising, therefore, that Rawcliffe has found that laundry was an oft-used motif for, I quote, preachers, poets, and homilists as a metaphor for spiritual cleansing, end quote. One sermon even uses doing the laundry to illustrate contrition. Rawcliffe stresses, too, that it is an activity that is weather dependent, requiring wind to dry the sheets. Christ as laundry is therefore a polyvalent and apt metaphor for reflecting performatively on the incarnation in a medieval context, one that Julian deploys to poignant effect. The image grounds Christ in the everyday that he redeems. The image is an invitation to the reader to see Christ's materiality bound up with human dirt and sickness, but also as the means for cleanliness and health, paralleling how Christ transforms sinful materiality into something divinely indwelt and pure. It is an image that shows that we hang in Christ, thus inviting an understanding of the relational ontology that Julian views as underpinning human interactions with God. Laundry and Christ are not conflated any more than we are subsumed into God. While Julian elsewhere says that that there is a difference, she notes that it's difficult to see, although it's nonetheless there. She says, "I saw no difference between God and our substance, but as it were all God. And still my understanding accepts that our substance is in God, that is to say that God is God, and our substance is a creature in God." The image of the laundry is thus also an invitation to a meditative gaze on the world around, to see it as a place of divine action and embodiment. Gillespie and Ross have suggested that Julian's revelations contain apophatic images, that is, images that negate themselves. Certainly the kind of imaginative invitation that Julian holds out is not merely cataphatic, in the sense that it is just an encouragement to imagine the mere narrative details of the Passion, as is perhaps the case with Philip's account of Elizabeth's dance. Like Elizabeth, Julian's images are often moving, true of the image of the laundry blowing in the wind, as well as other images that she adds to the long text, such as her comparison of the blood falling from Christ's head with drops of water bouncing off the eaves of a house during a storm. She writes, "I saw the bodily vision of the copious bleeding of the head persist. The great drops of blood fell from beneath the crown like pellets. The copiousness resembled drops of water which fall from the eaves of a house after a great shower of rain, falling so thick that no human ingenuity can count them." This highly eidetic image is striking in its down-to-earthness, but also its physical unattainability. Raindrops are tangible but vanish at the touch, colourful but because translucent and reflective, ordinary but elusive. Again, it invites the reader to call Christ to mind, even in the everyday event of a storm. The way that the image moves from materiality to divinity certainly has an apophatic feel, in that there's a pushing beyond the initial image of raindrops, on which the reader is not invited to settle in a narrative manner. At the same time, both this image and that of Christ as laundry operate to confound reason's natural propensity to linearity. At the same time, materiality is never despised. It is redeemed. From these two images, we can see that Julian is not averse to the more narrative performativity that we see in Elizabeth's dance. Julian herself adds a narrative detail to the Passion narrative, A Cold, Harsh Wind. At the same time, Julian's revelations are not particularly interested in encouraging untamed narrative fantasy of biblical events. When she writes that her text is written but not yet performed, this being an invitation to imaginative engagement, that she envisages the reader adding further images of their own as they meditate on her text. This invitation is more akin to Lectio Divina, in that her images act as hooks for deep theological reflection, with her image of the bleeding head operating as a kind of architectural structure into which all the other images are placed, remembered, and so interpreted. I recently talked about this image of Christ as laundry at a conference, and one delegate noted that the idea of hanging has very different connotations for Black Americans. At the same time, they commented positively on the way that Julian's image of the washed sheets embraces materiality. We were both reminded of Melissa Weaver's installation. The delegate commented on how these sheets are always decentered, pushing us off balance, but not in ways that abuse. Other delegates reminded me of the paintings of the Rothschilds' Canticle and of Christ suspended on a tree blooming with flowers and birds that hangs in Rome. Indeed, the questions became an example of the performative invitation that Julian's text extends, her encouragement to imagine operating as an invitation to engage in a dispersed but shared imagistic community, through which her revelatory text is performed and the act is affirmed. Philip also poses Elizabeth's dance as an invitation to perform the Passion, as a means of access to the mystical union that is assumed that she attained. Yet perhaps because it is so difficult to see it, as Julian notes, to see the difference between God and oneself, Philip fails to see the difference between Elizabeth and God, which she alone could perhaps have articulated. Lacking for me is therefore the redemption of Elizabeth's flesh. While there have been artistic attempts to engage with this dance, it's interesting that Zonda Flobergs, who is exploring female mystical texts through modern dance interpretations, has not yet danced Elizabeth, even though, or perhaps because, his recent work explores moments of abuse and trauma caused by the church. If we return for a moment again to Nielsen's quote, and her sense that the work of art's truthfulness is experienced in its ability to continue to speak meaningfully and transformatively about the human condition to those willing to enter its play, I'm left wondering about the idea of entering the play of Philip's portrayal of Elizabeth, which strikes me as much more complex than a performative engagement with Julian, even though it is Julian's text which for me is more performatively profound and difficult. While this is not the intention of Elizabeth's Vita of Elizabeth, in overlooking the need for redemption of Elizabeth's own materiality, Philip perhaps makes her less of an icon of the incarnation than he intends. And I think that's where I'll stop. Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me, and thank you, Teresa, for inviting me to speak. It's wonderful to be in such a beautiful church, and thank you for the beautiful film excerpt and for the talk from Louise. So I'm Elena Unger, and I want to speak not as a theorist or critic, but from within the folds, within the mess and the mystery of making as an artist. I'll be speaking about the relationship between space and meaning, about the role of the art object and the performance of being an artist. I'll do so through the lens of my recent exhibition, Slipping the Veil, my studio practice, and my academic research, though that was quite a long time ago, on Nicholas of Cusa's De Docta Ignorantia. Along the way, I'll thread in Bataille, Baudrillard, and what we might call the poetics of apocalypse. I'm interested in how space becomes charged, how it haunts and breathes, how it resists neutrality and becomes more than a backdrop, more than geometry, becoming instead a vessel. I'm also interested in how, as artists, we bear the metaphysical weight of that vessel, not just as formal constructors, but as intermediaries. What does it mean to make space for something beyond us, something we can't contain or control but might briefly brush against? This isn't just a spatial question, it's an existential one. In my dissertation, for my MPhil, The Anticipatory Echo, Doxological Spatialization in Nicholas of Cusa's De Docta Ignorantia, I developed the concept of doxological spatialization. Drawing from Cusa, I contrasted it with what I call immanent spatialization, a mode of space shaped by modernity's need to see, grasp, and master reality. Cusa, writing in the mid-15th century, offers not only a metaphysics, but a spatial theology, a doxological structure that resists both the representational violence of early modernity and the empty cynicism of postmodern collapse. Against a lineage that runs from Alberti to Descartes to Baudrillard, Cusa proposes a radically different ontology of the art object, not one of representation, but of contraction, a spatial unknowing that paradoxically becomes a site of revelation. To see this more clearly, we have to understand what I called in my dissertation the genealogy of immanent spatialization. It begins, innocently enough, in art, in the perspectival experiments of Brunelleschi and the linear grid of Alberti. Alberti's window becomes the blueprint for a space that is ostensibly ordered, objective, and true. But this space is also a fiction, a mirror that reflects the viewer's own disembodied eye, fixed at a single vanishing point. In the name of realism, Alberti suppresses lived time, embodied vision, and spiritual dimension. This perspectival apparatus, appropriated by the sciences and rationalized by the Cartesian cogito, becomes the foundation for what Carsten Harries calls the homelessness of modernity. In a world in which space has been flattened, God rendered immanent, and infinity replaced by the endless repeatability of finite parts, space ceases to be symbolic or liturgical. It becomes measurable, empty, dead. The accumulation of this logic is what John Baudrillard calls the simulacrum, the image that no longer refers to its source, but to itself, the hyperreal. We no longer experience the real, but the map of the real, which, as he puts it, precedes the territory. And when the map itself is all we have, then reality collapses into infinite referentiality, signs that only point to other signs. It's a legacy of linear perspective, Cartesian mapping, and visual control, a space that's locked in representation and closed to a true encounter. Cusa, on the other hand, gives us a radically different model, one in which space is not just constructed, but revelatory. A space shaped not by dominance, but by contraction, a term he uses to describe how the infinite makes room for the finite within itself, and also, to go to, the synsum and kenosis as well. It's the same sort of structure. Cusa's vision is not one of mere transcendence above, but of intimacy within, an enfolded infinity that becomes visible precisely in its partial concealment. And today I want to trace this idea across 3 domains. First, Cusa's notion of sacred space. Second, the modern crisis of representation as framed by Bataille and Baudrillard. And finally, my own attempt to enact these dynamics in my own work. So let's begin with Cusa. For him, the world isn't a container for fixed meanings, it's a field of ongoing revelation. His idea of contraction or contractio suggests that the infinite doesn't vanish to make room for the finite, rather it folds into it. The world becomes a site where the divine is not excluded, but expressed imperfectly, analogically, mysteriously. This form of spatiality isn't static or objective, it's participatory. Cusa likens it to a kind of liturgical seeing, where one doesn't just perceive, but is perceived. His most famous image is the Vera Icona, which has been mentioned by Louise. An icon whose eyes follow the viewer. And he talks about this in Divisione Dei. It's a visual metaphor for a gaze that contains all gazes, a perspectival infinity that contracts into each point of view without being exhausted by any of them. This, to me, is a profound model for art making. The idea that space can hold multiplicity without collapse, and that vision can be an act of reception rather than control. Compare that with the logic of linear perspective. In Alberti's model, the world becomes fixed, measurable, regular, available to the sovereign gaze of the artist. The viewer becomes a fixed point. The world becomes a vanishing point. What's lost in this model is not just metaphysical depth, but the very possibility of encounter. The infinite isn't contracted, it's evacuated, and the image ceases to be a threshold and becomes a surface. By the time we reach postmodernity, that surface has proliferated. Baudrillard calls this the realm of the simulacrum, a world of signs that no longer refer to anything beyond themselves. We see this everywhere today, in algorithmic aesthetics and the endless churn of content, in artworks that seem to speak only of their own gestures. As Baudrillard writes, the simulacrum is never what hides the truth. It is the truth that hides the fact that there is none. It's a bleak vision, and one that resonates deeply with what I see in the art world. An exhaustion of symbols, a kind of aesthetic fatigue. We're haunted not by ghosts, but by echoes of echoes. Appearances have replaced presences. Bataille responds to this not by restoring meaning, but tearing it apart. In his inner experience, he seeks not transcendence, but dissolution. For him, the only way out of the trap of representation is to sacrifice the self entirely, to enter a blind spot of consciousness where experience becomes annihilation. But while I respect Bataille's refusal of easy consolation, I think his void remains trapped in reflexivity. He's still inside the vanishing point, he's just turned it inside out. What Cusa offers instead is not a surrender to emptiness, but a hospitality to mystery. Not the destruction of meaning, but its transformation. In his model, the infinite doesn't erase the finite, it contracts into it. And I think this is the crux. Contraction preserves difference while allowing relation. It's what makes encounter possible within the work of art. Which brings me to a kind of case study of my show that's currently on at the moment at St. Bartholomew the Great, the one that I'm co-curating with James Freeman Gallery. Not trying to plug it, but you know. It's, yeah. So, it was in many ways, the show, my attempt to perform doxological spatialization. St. Bartholomew's is a 900-year-old church, dense with presence. I mean, the walls are, you know, it's like the patina of human presence is everywhere in the space. And its Norman arches don't just lift the eye, they tilt time. Visitors often say they discover the church as though it appeared out of nowhere even after walking past it for years. That sense of delayed arrival of spatial latency was central to our curatorial approach with the show. As we wrote in the curatorial statement, St. Bartholomew's is a church of fragments, yet these fragments coalesce into something larger than the sum of their parts. In its emptiness, it doesn't feel empty at all. It becomes a container for memory, for resonance, a conduit that invites the past into the present. The space didn't just host the works, it shaped them. We selected pieces not as static objects, but as presences, each one engaging with the idea of a living stone of St. Bart's. Some are relic-like, others are completely immersive, like the sound installation collaboration I did with Nick Cave. All aim to create a tension between what is seen and what is intuited. In my curation, I tried to stage what I call apocalyptic space. But apocalypse here does not mean catastrophe or Armageddon. It means unveiling, apocalypsis in the Greek sense, the lifting of the veil. Apocalypse for me is the moment when the temporal collapses into the eternal, when the ruins of the finite finally receive the kiss of the infinite. In Christian terms, parousia, the return of Christ, but it is also more generally the longed-for union of the lovers, God and humanity, presence and absence, image and source. This apocalyptic union is not quiet, it's rending, it requires destruction, not for its own sake, but so that something larger, something truer might emerge. The world must be torn open, the veil must slip, and that moment of terror and tenderness, and in that moment of terror and tenderness, we glimpse the face behind the icon. In this way, every true work of art becomes apocalyptic. Not because it brings an end, but because it makes a clearing, a space where the visible touches the invisible, where time opens, where we as viewers feel ourselves seen, like in Chiusa's Vera Icona. These works don't depict endings, they hold the possibility of revelation. They're not resolved, they're saturated. They try to host the infinite without possessing it and trapping it. And crucially, they rely on the viewer, not as consumer, but as co-participant. Just as Chiusa's icon requires a gaze to reveal its gaze, these works are to be met and not mastered. So what does all of what I've said and everything else mean for the artist today? I don't think it means refusing the roles we're so often offered. The content producers, I think it means, I do actually think it means refusing the roles we're so often offered. The content producer, the sovereign voice, the nihilistic trickster. Instead, we might reclaim a more ancient role, not as seer, but as space maker. Someone who contracts their will, their ego, their control in order to allow something beyond themselves to appear, however fleetingly, however partially. I'm not advocating that artists return to mysticism or religiosity in any doctrinal sense. What I'm imploring them to do, however, is to take the ethical and ontological risk of making space for the unknown, for the other, for the infinite. In my painting, as in my curatorial practice, that takes the form of highly presenced absence, of giving and withholding, of constructing works that suggest rather than declare, that unveil without fixing, that invite a viewer not to consume, but to dwell within. So, to return to the question I began with, what does it mean to make space today as an artist for the infinite, for the other, the sacred, when space itself feels saturated, flattened, and exhausted? I think the purpose of the work of art and the being of the artist is to stand within the space of unknowing and to give form to it without enclosing it. It's to risk everything, including meaning itself, but it is also to hope, irrationally perhaps, that form is not betrayal of something beyond form, and that to speak the unspeakable even imperfectly is still to give praise. Thank you.
Thank you for this very rich presentations. I got two mics. I have questions, but maybe I'm also quite happy to start by you, or maybe you have questions for each other. Or okay, so let's go straight. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to Teresa for sending me a random invite to this event, which I otherwise wouldn't have heard about. So yeah, just it's kind of a strange comment, actually. I think it's related to everything people said, which I really enjoyed. And it's something about the difficulty of mysticism in a certain sense, and holding open these spaces, and the question of contraction and all of these things. But I was very struck by the Elizabeth of Spalbeck, well, the Philip of whatnot, talking about Elizabeth. And this sounds slightly blasphemous talking about it in a church, but it reminded me of nothing more than, I really don't know if I can say this in church, but these sorts of terrible performances, let's say, of, I can't even remember the names, women who are having sex with hundreds of men, right, as a kind of performance. And Philip's description of what Elizabeth is doing really reminded me of this. And I think we're surrounded by a whole series of performances constantly, right? Like, there's almost like complete excess of representation, a complete excess of transparency, or the desire for transparency, millions of attempts at kind of failed liturgies and even failed apocalypses, in the sense that you were talking about it as this unveiling, constant attempts to show everything is in 3D hyper saturation. Like, it's a sort of attempt to kind of eliminate any mystery. And we're all familiar with, I don't know, Instagram and this kind of thing, where I think this is happening constantly. And I suppose it's something about this difficulty of keeping this space for the mystical in general, not just in art, but kind of in the modern world. It's like the entirety of the modern world seems to want to destroy the mystical, or to try to render it so, to describe it as a kind of madness, or to sort of make it completely liminal, or associate it with terrible things. And I just wonder if you could all speak maybe a bit more about this, the mystical today, like why, how modernity maybe has made it so unfamiliar to us, maybe. I hope that made sense.
Anyone want to start? Does it have to do maybe with that sacredness of that which you can't really approach, that is veiled behind, when we think of the Holy of Holies in the temple, that there's that space of union and presence of God that is hidden behind the veil, and that should remain sort of sacred, and only, I believe, just once a year the priest could go into that space, but it was kept closed and sacred. So maybe it has to do with an understanding of sacredness, or the profanation of all. And profanation. So how you can enter. And I think when I mentioned us being the third, as we go into these letters and into these, as so many times private letters are published, and we enter suddenly into the most intimate of a relationship. How do we do it, and how do we do it carefully, and what are the consequences of that? How of publishing and bringing into public something so intimate and personal? I wouldn't know what to say. I wouldn't know what else to say, but maybe it has something to do with the sacred and profanation, sacredness and profanation.
So when I was preparing this talk, and I was thinking about performance, and I thought, well, Elizabeth of Spalbeck's in a way an obvious candidate to talk about, but it's really, the more I looked at her for this talk, the more I thought, my goodness, I don't like this text. And other academics have criticized this kind of devotion that arises in the later Middle Ages as a kind of indulgence of the imagination. But Alexandra Barrett calls it, in relation to another text, she said that it's nothing but kind of narcissism and despair. That's where it's going to lead. It's not going to lead to any kind of liberation. But she sees something different going on in Julian's text, because Julian is also, I don't think she wants to keep apart the sacred and the profane. She wants to see God in the raindrops and the laundry and everything, to have that kind of sense of incarnational quality to it. But she just manages to revivify everything and make it alive with something good, where it seems to me that Philip has forgotten the beauty of the things, the materiality of things. And so, I mean, it is it's awful. There's a lot, I mean, we could have talked a lot about the male gaze and all kinds of issues to do with Philip, and with many medieval texts where women are kind of lacerated and all kinds of things like this. But I don't know why it's entirely lost in the modern world, because I think my research stops at about 1500 as a theologian. So I would hesitate to guess about that, and I think you'll probably be better at telling us about the modern malaise than I would be. But I think it's I'm not sure what to do with a text like Elizabeth's, and I wondered, talking to a room where people deal in art, what you make of a text like Elizabeth, and my discomfiture as a medievalist of what Philip does with her, really, but why I really like Julian and can feel kind of at ease, even though there's this bleeding Christ all the time. He's still there, but somehow there is space for mystery, yeah. But anyway,
Just before I pass it on, it did remind me a little bit of the artist I mentioned, Luisa Nobrega, and her sort of this destruction, of this harming that she was doing to herself in those actions, and my almost mourning her, like, but can't you sense the kiss of his love? Where are you that he's caught? Where are you for the face to face? So in this sort of destruction and withdrawal, as you say, where is she? And I related to that. But
Were you referring to the Julian of Norwich passage, or the other one where she's sort of rending herself and really harming herself? Right. No, I thought so. I was just making sure. Yeah, I thought so. I kind of see what you mean with the sort of I do kind of see what I hate to admit it, but I do kind of see what you mean, which is yeah, there is that sense of kind of all the self-flagellation without any of the kind of telos going. It's just today, not in the text. I mean, in what you're referring to, because I know exactly what you're referring to. Yeah, I suppose. I mean, that's kind of what I was really talking about in my talk. It's but that's also why I find Cusa so interesting, because he was around at a time when technology was sort of taking humans beyond what they thought their minds were capable of containing. I mean, the human mind is constantly being stretched and externalized. Now we have AI where we can basically externalize our entire brain into a separate hard drive, essentially, and we don't really have to do any of our thinking ourselves, which is terrifying and terrible. But Cusa, what I found really interesting about him was that he said, no, the technology this was in his day when technology was, again, it was a massive leap, but it wasn't as crazy as the leap we are in now. He said, let's use technology. Let's use it towards participatory ends, and sort of towards ends of further comprehending and taking part in the divine. I don't know if that's possible now. I'm trying to do it myself. I'm constantly trying to do it in the work that I do in art. I think that we're in an age that really seeks out immersion. And obviously we go towards things like the virtual reality and stuff like that. But in general, I think the public just has an appetite for greater and greater and greater immersion, which is kind of interesting in a world where we're less about as techies call it, the meat space. We're really into virtuality, yet when people go to art exhibitions, they want to have like lights and bangs and things for it to even register with them. People won't really stare at a painting. People won't really kind of they are, yeah, sorry, I'm kind of thinking about this on the spot, but I don't know, it's like there's this kind of dual tendency where people both really want immersion, they really want participation, and technology is forcing us in the opposite direction. So and I think that may be an interesting thing for artists and for people who are trying to look for an alternative, I guess, to what the contemporary is kind of giving us. So maybe I'm thinking like Cusa, there may be inroads to what? Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah.
that was,
Sorry. Those meandering, but I don't know.
I'm not quite sure what the question is, but maybe there's something that I'm interested in, for example, in the relationship between giving space, which Elena mentioned in her talk, something about how an artwork gives space. I think of cinema, certain kinds of cinemas as giving space, and it's sort of not often, it's not often clear how a cinema can give space, because sometimes a film might think it's giving space, but it's not. And also the relationship between that and reflection, reflexive space. So there's a kind of tension, I think, often between the act of giving space in art and the onus on the viewer to reflect or to have a reflexive relationship, so that that space doesn't become merely, in my language, I'm not sure of it in Elena's, immersive, which this immersive, I'm not sure whether Cusa thinks of it as immersive in a passive sense or in a mystical, productive sense, I'm not sure. But in any case, in the context of entertainment, which we're immersed in ourselves, I feel immersion is a problematic kind of drive, or a problematic, kind of type of consumption. So that was always my relationship to film language. How can film language give space, and also at the same time be positioned to engage the viewer, to complete or to participate in the completion of the proposal, whatever, the filmic proposal. So I think those spaces are fewer now, definitely, and I think the kind of sort of forms of the foundations through which one can create those spaces are definitely not so solid really anymore. And I was just talking about, this to somebody at Goldsmiths where I teach, a student, sort of talking about art writing, and the kind of theory writing that used to exist in relation to the image in, say, 70s, people like Laura Mulvey and people like that, who were so explicitly talking about the image and how the image functions at many different levels, and the answer I got to that was that actually, a lot of art writing now is really about itself, and also because there are there's a wide range of references now that it's almost like in a kind of hall of mirrors, if you like. The signifieds lead to the signified, so it's a kind of bouncing, set of references that bounce off each other, or signifiers point to signifiers rather than to sources. And I think that came up in your talk as well, and I think that's really is very much why we're in this situation, probably, in my view. Yeah.
Hello. Hello. Can you hear me? Is it coming through? Great. I'll sit here so I can see you all. I've been thinking about something that you named very near the beginning of the experience economy, and I guess this relates to what we were just talking about with the desire for immersion and immersive art experiences and things like that. So I'm thinking about like the tension between a personal transformation where I engage in some kind of activity. It might be spiritual, it might be mystical, it might be meditation, it might be dancing at a festival, that sort of transforms myself, and how it seems to me that there's a real appetite for that at the moment, and that it dovetails quite easily with with the logic of like self-optimization, of like, I'm going to go to a festival and, you know, immerse myself in the rave and completely transform myself in a way that feels like it has something in common with mysticism. And then I go back to my normal job and I'm a better human being and I'm more productive, and all this kind of wellness logic and things like that. And I guess my question is, what does Christian mysticism offer that goes beyond that? For myself, I'm thinking it might be something more like a total transformation of the self, beyond the self, where there's kind of no going back to normal life or something. It seems to me that that's what the Christian mystics were doing, a sort of total self-annihilation. But any of you, what do you think it offers beyond this kind of like temporary self-transformation to optimize myself?
I'd say within the kind of thinking around what Christian mysticism is and how it works, of course there are experiences, but the idea of me experiencing something and that experiencing being mine is something that I think the Christian mystics that I work on want to bring into question. There's a kind of letting go of self, not an obliteration of you, but such that the difference between you and God is hard to see. And so it's not about having an experience or immersing yourself in another experience. It's about maybe doing something that really you don't want to do. So it's kind of has an ascetic bent to it, which I think is rather abused in Philip's account of Elizabeth. And perhaps if we had her own words about what was going on, we'd have a very different understanding of what she meant, what she felt was actually happening to her in this dance. So I think for me, it's that there's a sense of, it's about having an awareness of the world that it isn't as it first seems, and that actually might mean giving things up that you don't want to give up, rather than going to a rave dance and kind of being immersed in it and coming away feeling a little bit kind of high. It's not that. That's kind of what William James said mysticism is, which is why he took ethanol and was it ethanol ether and said, oh, I've had a mystical experience, and why Evelyn Underhill got very cross with him and said, no, you haven't, because it's a whole life of maybe renunciation and denial that will lead you there. So I think there's something about that maybe. So it's about seeing God in the everyday, but it's not just about but it's difficult to do. Something like that would be my answer.
Well, Teresa of Avila could answer that because, you know, she obviously has her, it was a lifelong journey. I mean, it didn't happen immediately when she had these sort of special moments of union with God. But, and I'm not a specialist in mysticism, but at least Teresa of Avila, she shared her writings not only to defend, with the Inquisition, but she wrote to teach her nuns, and she, as I said, she's still used now till today for spiritual transformation. And she goes through 7. So in the interior castle, she goes through 7 different stages in order to reach that the mystical wedding, mystical marriage in the 7th. In the 7th mansion or 7th dwelling. And there are stages that you have to go through, and every door to get to the next dwelling, you need to go through, I think there's 3 things that you need to do in order to get through the different mansions. That is, a prayer, self-reflection, and humility. And then I think from the 6th to the 7th mansion, I think there's no doors. I believe, but these are journeys. But then it's not a longing, it's maybe not a desire, but there's this. Is it a thirst? Because thirst seems is very deep, but there is this anxious sort of need to consume experiences that is maybe pointing to a deeper need, but then is it how it's not satiated? I mean, we keep on consuming, so there is obviously no we're not satiated. So it's actually an objectification of experience, an objectification of the mystic, and then we can go back, to the phallic sort of, but consumerism of experience, where we think an experience is something that you can have and touch, but that's not really what we're looking for, and that's not what the mystics, I think, propose.
Can I just add to that it's not a denial of our human experiences. People like Hadovich have an orgasm when they receive the Eucharist. I mean, it's a very human encounter, but it's about, and not about the fact that we should give up our desires in that sense, but it's about knowing that God's love is endless and is therefore a kind of meeting point for all our endless hungriness in a way. There's something about that within mysticism that kind of wants us to invite us in, I think. So it is a self-denial, but not a self-denial. Not very helpful, sorry.
I mean, I think the fundamental difference is there's no verticality to it. There's no sense of a teleology beyond to anything else, beyond an empty descent into the self, or an empty kind of actually removal from the self of like, oh, I'm going out and experiencing this great, vibey thing or whatever. I mean, I'm by no means kind of a Puritan. I definitely go and do my share of whatever. But, I think that to sort of reduce mystical experience down to that is just, to sort of experiences that are, I think, at the end of the day, kind of vacuous and empty, and really the whole kind of self-help, wellness, sort of whatever industry, I guess, is just, I think, quite kind of empty and absurd, and doesn't really, again, no verticality, no sense of anything, not even really horizontality, because it's not even about the people you're with, it's kind of just about yourself, and, oh, how can I optimize me? I don't even know who I am. I don't know my place in the world or in the universe or in my community or amongst anything. It's kind of just pure self without any rooting of the self in anything. And again, then it's really just chasing a kind of momentary serotonin, dopamine, whatever hit, like rats in an experiment, sort of getting their, little brain waves, little whatever pleasure centers. It's like tricking yourself into feeling better about the sort of horrors of modern life, so that you can go back to your finance job. Sorry to my boyfriend who is in a finance job. But, and kind of do something that you maybe don't really feel that great about, and then so that we can continue to kind of be little cogs in the capitalist machine. You know what I mean? Like, it's sorry, but it's that really, and I think that it's peddled to us, and I think that it's kind of, I think to compare the two is just silly, and I actually think it's quite nefarious, because it's like, okay, let's take this experience, let's take the idea of experience, right? Let's remove it from, and I mean experience in like the truest sense of an experience that goes beyond ourselves, where we sort of empty ourselves, where we do, transcendent experience, right? Ecstatic experience. And then let's like remove it from all of its source, but then take all of the supposed feeling, create like a simulacra of it, and then, replace the actual real thing, so that, yeah, basically.
Maybe just a thought as this conversation is developing. Thank you for your question. Maybe I was just thinking, well, and also in relation to what you propose in the outline for this talk, which is like, is it ultimately technê? Is actually an attempt, the sort of present day attempt at this experience through art can only result in what you're calling technê, something very removed from the source of true mysticism, maybe. I don't know whether you mean that or not. But I was just thinking whether mystical experience in the true or false sense, because there are mystical experiences that are also false, I think, but whether it's an elitist kind of experience, whether actually, in a sense, we have to live through the mystics and vicariously experience, like I think that going to a festival and giving yourself up to these kinds of vicarious experiences as replicas is quite, it's not a bad thing. It's not that there's no harm or less harm, but it's a kind of thing to do that is reasonable to do, and that it is different from when you return to work. Maybe it has to be, obviously, but that I think there's something, beginning to think that actually the mystical experience is unattainable, in many ways. It's not something that we can really even hope to aim for, because it is a lifelong dedication, and most of us don't dedicate our lives to the pursuit of that experience. And I think for us, we live through the mystics, possibly. I certainly lived through Teresa in my film, and it was a film experience. It wasn't a mystical experience. It was a filmic experience through which I become Teresa. Teresa becomes part of me, and I network with her, and I inscribe myself in the film and in something to do with her, So, and it is art. It's not, mysticism in that way. So I'm just beginning to think about the mystics in a different way through this conversation and in this new way, yeah.
Thank you for that. When even if one does follows a spiritual journey with the mystics or with Teresa, they might not get a mystical experience, because it is something that is given gratuitously, right? It's something that some people receive, and some will never receive. So, but in reference to technê, what I think technê and the artifice and art comes in is exactly in that longing for something, and in that longing we produce art. I mean, it responds to that, maybe that longing for a unity, a longing for a union with God, a longing for the union with the other, but I think that's when technê just takes that space, and the artifice. But
I say that in many of these mystics, the idea of experience being the most important thing isn't that they would reject that. So Dennis Turner would say, well, you were talking about an experience economy where we all want experiences, but they want to know God, and that might be to have no experiences. So but I think they do want it to be accessible. Julian wants everyone to be able to experience it in watching raindrops and the laundry and all kinds of other images, and herring fish scales, all kinds of stuff as well. So, but yeah.
And Teresa devises her manuals for her nuns so that they can follow her path.
Yes, but I think she doesn't insist too much on trying to have the mystical experience.
No,
I believe. But let's. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks. It's been so interesting. And Teresa, I just want to pick up, you've introduced the concept of union with God and unity, and I think that must be key to any discussion of mysticism, I think. And I think it's, the reason I suppose I wanted to pick up on it is it's a bit of a counter to some of the rather binary statements I've heard expressed, which are not apophatic, but cataphatic. And I think that if we are talking about unity and union with God, we do, I suppose at some point we have to talk about God, right? I'm not going to do that now, don't worry, but one of the questions that you posed in your pitch for this in your preface to this event was, what is mysticism without the bridegroom? Which I think is pointing towards that question, yeah. And so I think that, what I would like to say is that I think that in terms of this longing, the reason for that longing is a form of suffering. And I think I would say we must not dismiss people's suffering, okay? And therefore their rationale for seeking experience. You know, there's an emptiness, and that is a form of suffering, right? And it can lead to, well, actually it can lead to, certainly to death, definitely, and a lot of self-harm, and there's a lot of it about. So I do think that we have to respect people's need and their work that they do, even if we may consider it misguided in various ways. And I would also suggest that hopefully God also respects that as part of our freedom that we're given. And I would just bring that back to art, actually, the freedom that we have within art to seek and to make mistakes. And maybe be on that journey, really, of imperfect journey.
I think that going back to this idea of art as the technê, as that which comes and licks the wound, and that's something that Catherine Ludwig mentions. That art comes, writing comes when the wound is left open, a wound that is a wound of a crack of separation, or the heart that's been pierced and that leaves that and then is gone. And I think art comes in and licks it, real art, or not art, but technê comes in and licks that wound, and it's our it's our own work in relating to that wound without really quite knowing how to, in a clumsy way, or
Are you handing to me because you want me to say something? I mean, when you mentioned cataphatic and apophatic, and I'd say that for me, Julian of Norwich isn't cataphatic or apophatic. She has a lot of, her images deny themselves in a way. They push beyond themselves. But they're also very cataphatic in the sense that cataphatic is the kind of down-to-earth, ordinary, everyday. But I think in some ways she's what Martin Laird calls logophatic, meaning that, which I've called kind of sacred eloquence. Her writing is a kind of sacred eloquence. It points the reader towards, in her case, Christ. If we were looking at Islamic mystics, they would point in another direction. And I think that mysticism, the mysticism I work on is grounded in Christianity and therefore points towards it. Other mystics point, in other directions. But I think that they do interesting things with images and language that sometimes I only understand when I see artists engage with them. I never liked Marguerite Perret's work because it was just too difficult. And I made a short film in which an artist really identifies with Marguerite Perret. And in her kind of engagement with Marguerite Perret, in her kind of sense that Marguerite Perret is kind of railing against the society in which she lived. And she's actually, Annemie van Kerken is concerned about all these issues to do with technology and the way that female form is kind of like portrayed within the media. And she sort of felt that Marguerite Perret was in some way doing the same thing and was kind of using images and words in ways that upset society, and she's doing the same stuff. And I suddenly understood Marguerite Perret. So I'm thankful to artists because actually you help me understand the text I'm trying to work on that I don't understand. So please keep on engaging with them, even if I learn a lot from looking at how we engage with these texts, more so than often thinking about it theologically, which is not a response to your question, but I think.
We have five minutes if anyone has an urgent question. Does anyone here have any other questions or anything to say? Or shall we just finish there? So artists, keep doing your work. Thank you. Thank you.